So after the release of my last video, the next thing you all requested the most was a guide on how to build in SMITE and SMITE 2. I was hesitant at first to produce a video for building in SMITE because I know that item metas are very transient and creating a guide that works in perpetuity is going to be a challenge. With that being said, I'm taking a different approach with this video. Instead of only providing you with cookie cutter builds to try like most prominent content creators, I think it's more worth it to teach you all the critical thinking you need to determine what you should be building on your own, in both SMITE and SMITE 2. Have you ever heard the saying, give someone a fish and feed them for a day, but teach them how to fish and feed them for a lifetime? That's what I'll be doing here. I may use builds with current items from SMITE 1 as examples, but that will just be to support my points. And I can't guarantee that the builds will be good in perpetuity. For this video, I'm going to also assume that you have some base knowledge of SMITE, like what the difference is between hard CC and soft CC, or what each stat is or does, and also the cap for each stat that you can get, if there is one. If you aren't sure on those things, then you can check out the SMITE wiki for more info. I started making this video before SMITE 2 went into the 24/7 alpha, which means most of the footage is going to be from SMITE 1, and so will the builds. But to be fair, that's what most everyone is familiar with, and also SMITE 2 didn't change the formula too much for builds. But a couple mechanics did change how building works, and here are the changes that matter. Physical power and magical power are now renamed to strength and intelligence respectively. You can build both as any god in SMITE 2, but every god has their own varying levels of scaling from intelligence and strength. Like some may get no benefit from one or the other on any of their abilities at all. So it's important that you understand what stats your character will use effectively by reading their ability descriptions. In addition, some characters get some ability scaling from their protections now, which encourages you to build protections to increase your damage, instead of strength or intelligence. And lastly, while some characters only have one type of scaling, either intelligence or strength on their abilities, every single god has by default 100% strength and 20% intelligence scaling on their basic attacks. And as a result, the item store is no longer split between magical and physical power items, depending on your god's damage type. There's more build flexibility in the game since it's combined. Now you can see gods like Soul building Deathbringer or gods like Chalk purchasing Book of Ta. All of these changes really mean that you should become more familiar with the mechanisms and scalings behind every god's kit more than ever before. Knowing what all of the items in the store offer has also become more important than ever too, given that there's so many options now for every single god, which brings me to my next topic. Every purchase you make in a MOBA will be a cost-benefit decision, meaning you have to decide repeatedly as you craft your build which items are going to give you the most benefit, whether that benefit comes immediately after you buy it, in the long run, or both. Since you are limited on item slots, not only are you spending gold as a resource to buy items, but you are also spending item slots, which means that it's important that you maximize the benefit from the items that you buy using those slots. With that said, the best way to know what to build will be to know what all of the items in the store do, what they're good at, what they're bad at, and then think about what would be the right time to build them. A good example for this would be stacking items. It makes sense to buy stacking items early because it takes time to get their full value after you purchase them. Another example of this would be for the carry role. You will need some sort of sustain to keep you from having to back too often, so opting for lifesteal early will help keep you in lane longer to farm up more. And to add another example, percentage penetration is typically best bought a little later in builds, like usually after your second full item at least, since gods will get more protections over time, and percentage penetration becomes more effective the more protections enemies have. But it's not just stats that you have to worry about either, it's also item actives and passives. Like when playing as support, if there's a lot of big team fight CC on the enemy team that can make or break a fight, you might want an item that cleanses CC for your teammates, and you might want that pretty early on before things get out of control. Or if they have a lot of healing, you'll probably want some sort of anti-heal item early on before that gets out of control too. Those are just a few examples of possible things to consider when building, and memorizing all of the options in the store will help you make the decisions of what to build and when. If you would like to learn more about the stats and how they work in SMITE, I would suggest checking out this page on the SMITE wiki. You may be surprised by some of the things that you learn there. There are two other very important things that you need to know when crafting a build. The first is understanding what your own character exceeds at and where they have gaps. You'll want the items in your build to synergize with your strengths or mitigate your weaknesses. The best way to learn this is to read their abilities and just play the god. Once you get a feel for their abilities, their base stats, and their playstyle, you can more easily deduce what item stats and passives will synergize with their kit. Let's take an example and look at SMITE 1's Cirquette. Her kit consists of high ability burst that scales off of physical power, hypermobility from having 2 movement abilities, inherent crit chance from her ultimate, and abilities that can critically strike. She also has anti-heal and decent forms of CC lockdown, but she is relatively squishy as evident by her stats. Because of her high ability burst, you would want power and penetration, as those stats complement physical burst well. Since she is squishy with no sustain or protections in her kit barring the mitigations in her ult, and since her only CC immunity is dependent on enemies being near her, maybe 1 or 2 items with protections would be nice, like Protector of the Jungle, Magi's Cloak, Spirit Robe, or Mantle of Discord, for example. Even movement speed would be helpful, like Serrated Edge, which also conveniently has penetration. And to top it all off, cooldown reduction, also known as CDR, benefits both her ability to survive due to having multiple movement abilities and increases her overall CC and damage output. So, an example build may look something like this. Eye of the Jungle, which would become Protector of the Jungle for the power and protections late game, Jotun's Wrath for the early flat penetration and CDR, Rage for the crit chance and power, Serrated Edge for the penetration, MS, power, and lifesteal sustain, Magi's Cloak for the survivability, and Malicious Deathbringer for more CD reduction with its passive, crit chance, and crit damage. Now this build entirely ignores things like the state of the game, whether you're ahead or behind, in which case building something expensive and stacking dependent like crit with Rage and Deathbringer might not be the best option. It also doesn't factor in enemy god picks and their builds, which is the next topic, know your enemy. Just as important as knowing your god's strengths and weaknesses is knowing the same for the opposing team. This will require memorization of god kits and playstyles, which will happen after you play as or against them. If you really want to build well, ideally you should have experience playing every single god in the game at least a few times. Getting each god to Mastery 1 would be a good start for a foundational understanding of every god's kit and playstyle. Once you build that knowledge base, you can use it to craft builds that will abuse enemy weaknesses. Let's take a specific god and talk about what to build to counter them. For this example, we will say we are playing against a Mulan. Firstly, she deals physical damage, so if you are looking to be tankier, building physical defense would reduce her damage against you. Mulan's playstyle is ability based. Her abilities will be her primary source of damage. She is a very in-your-face tank which needs to be close to you, animating to get her damage off. When counter-building her, carries may want to go penetration builds with Kinsai if she's especially tanky, as that will do the highest potential damage. Mages could build Ethereal Staff and Soul Reaver to increase their DPS against her and make her less tanky overall because of Ethereal Staff's passive. They could also build movement speed to make it harder for her to get on them. However, I wouldn't expect to win trades on most mages versus a warrior like Mulan. Junglers probably shouldn't try to fight a tanky solo lane Mulan either unless they are fed, have significant sustain and penetration, like from Soul Eater, Bumba's Hammer, and Serrated Edge, or if they are an auto attack jungler that can use Kins, Executioner, and other penetration items well. Supports could go CDR items like Pridwin or Breastplate of Valor to increase their CC output to help peel her off their carries or peel for themselves. They could also go Spirit Robe to help mitigate some damage when she hits her pull on you. Abyssal Stone would help reduce her cooldowns to slow her ability spam, and Contagion would reduce her healing while dealing some extra damage and granting physical protections. Solos would probably build very similarly to the other classes depending on what type of god they are. Kins if they are an auto attack heavy god, maybe Sigil to punish her for using her abilities on you, Contagion and Spirit Robe would be good here too. Even matching her sustain with Phoenix Shield, Soul Eater, or Jotun's Vigor could work. You could also try Mystical Mail to get lane pressure and some more damage which could help box her. There's many things you can do to counter certain aspects of her kit, or surpass her strengths with your own. You just gotta know how she works, and that's the same premise that goes for every other god in the game. One of the most crucial things to know about building items is that the order you build items in matters a lot. Spending too much gold on an item that doesn't do enough early on will hurt your power spike, or spending gold on an item that requires stacks too late into the game will never reach its true value. Some examples of bad build ordering might be buying a high percent penetration item as mid, jungle, or carry first before anyone builds any prots on the enemy team, and before your team can pull any objectives like Gold Fury. Or another example could be buying a protection item first in the jungle before a damage item, nerfing your jungle clear. Another could be not buying any percentage penetration until too late in the game, after the tanks have had their protection items for quite a while. One that I see a lot is people upgrading their glyphs before building items with actual stat increases. That 600 gold for a glyph upgrade is about the cost of a tier 1 item, meaning you would be foregoing a tier 1's worth of stats for essentially an item passive, which probably would serve you better after another full item or two at least. Another example of bad build ordering might be buying Deathbringer before any other crit items. It's expensive and relies on more crit chance to be most effective. As a solo laner, not buying magical prots until 3 or 4 items in, even though the enemy team has a magical jungler, can put you behind if you get ganked. The 3 carry roles, mid, jungle, and carry, typically want to slot at least 10 to 20% penetration somewhere in their build by the 3rd full item, as long as the enemy team has a couple of gods building tanky, finishing with about 30 to 40% penetration usually. Flat penetration is more impactful before the enemy builds protection items because of how protections have diminishing efficiency the more that you buy. So buying a flat pen item within the first few items will give you a big damage spike early game, which is why items like Jotuns, Devourers, and Doomorb are so good to rush. Items that also scale off your stats, like Gladiator's Shield, Pridwin, Curse Weaver, etc., all of those are likely better purchased after buying items that complement those items' passives, not before. When you're ideating about a potential build, things like this should be in the forefront of your mind. All of these are just examples. There's many more logical deductions you can make once you learn the intricacies of the game, or by expanding your knowledge of the game through playing or learning the nitty-gritty mechanics behind SMITE through experimentation, or utilizing any of the resources available to you online. One thing new players may have issues with is finding an identity for their builds. Thus, one of the big things they should know are the typical build archetypes for each role, as knowing about how they work will help you choose which one to build towards, or help you determine how to build and play against them. For each role, there's a few categories that the builds will usually fall into, typically with some exceptions or changes during certain metas. Keep in mind, you will want to look at your character's strengths and weaknesses to know what build archetypes can work and will get you to the end result with the least friction. I will be showing all of the SMITE 1 build archetypes that I know of here, but I would also have to imagine the archetypes will be very similar in SMITE 2, if not the same. Still, the core principles will apply across both games. You can find a build archetype suitable for your god and suitable against the enemy team, and then build down that path, adjusting where you need to accordingly based on everything talked about earlier in this video. The rest of this video will honestly be very formulaic as I go down the list of build archetypes, so feel free to jump around to whatever you're interested in. I'll give a little preface before each role to talk about what relics are usually good for that role, and then I'll dive into an overview of the build archetypes with example builds and gods that might fit into those archetypes. The carry role really only has 4 main build archetypes, which vary only slightly: penetration, crit, ability-based, and mage carries. They'll want a healthy balance of power, penetration, item damage, and attack speed, with some variance in builds that rely more on abilities or crit chance. Relics for this role will usually be beads and Aegis, but you could justify running Blink to be more aggressive in a small number of cases, or very rarely Shell instead of Aegis to help deal with wall characters, as long as the enemy team doesn't have any burst damage that needs to be Aegis'd. Penetration builds will be one of the 2 most common carry builds you will see, and it can be built successfully on almost any hunter that has a basic attack focused kit, meaning their main source of damage will come from them hitting many basic attacks and triggering basic attack items frequently. Gods that thrive the most with this type of build are gods like Charybdis, Rama, or Heimdallr. These builds will generally contain lots of power, penetration items, a single lifesteal item, a high amount of attack speed items, and basic attack proc items. They'll also be used to primarily increase DPS versus tanky targets. The tier 1 starters for these builds vary wildly, often including Mannequin Scepter, Death's Toll, Leather Cowl, or Gilded Arrow, and ultimately which one you purchase will depend on if you need a little extra sustain, if you clear mostly with damage from your autos, or if you want to fight early and get pressure. A typical build may look like Diamond Arrow for lots of basic attack damage, added gold gain, attack speed, and penetration, Devourer's Gauntlet for lifesteal and early flat penetration, Executioner with either glyph, varying depending on their level of healing and shielding, for % protection shred and attack speed, Kinsai for the attack speed and basic attack item proc damage that scales highly versus tankier gods, Odysseus Bow for attack speed and basic attack item proc damage against all enemies, and Silver Branch Bow for more attack speed, penetration, and a large influx of power. I'd go Titan's Bane last if your god doesn't have an attack speed stim, since you wouldn't get much value out of Silver Branch. Also, the primary starter can really be any of these other items too. Mannequin Mace, Leader's Cowl, Hunter's Cowl, Death's Temper, or Death's Embrace, and be viable on certain gods in certain situations. The stats and passives from these items make this a well-balanced build, but keep in mind, you may want to flex items at any time in and out of any of these builds I show you depending on what the enemy team is playing or building. Crit builds will be the other most common carry build that you'll see. It can be built on pretty much any hunter, but I wouldn't go crit on hunters that would be better with ability builds, like Chiron, Neith, or Martikaros. Charybdis and Heimdallr also have their own reasons for not using the crit build, like Charybdis just procs basic attack items more often for more damage overall with that type of build, and Heimdallr has an inherent reduction of crit damage to balance him because of his unique basic attack chain. Crit builds will usually contain power, crit chance items, a lifesteal item, some attack speed, a couple penetration items, and Deathbringer, the staple of the crit build. Building crit is usually expensive, making it a difficult build to opt into while behind, but it usually scales very well into late game, helping you to outtrade junglers and burst mages, increase your jungle boss objective damage, or in the much later stages of the game, even DPS tanks effectively. The tier 1 starters for these builds will often include Gilded Arrow, Leather Cowl, and Death's Toll, as all of these have upgrades that will synergize well with the crit build by offering stats like crit chance, % power increase, or % basic attack damage increase. A typical build may look like Death's Temper for increased attack speed and basic attack damage from the passive, Devourers for lifesteal and early flat penetration, Boomerang for attack speed and high crit chance, Dominance for attack speed, mana regen, and penetration on your basic attacks specifically, Demon Blade for added penetration, attack speed, and crit chance, and then finally a Devoted Deathbringer for the increased crit damage passive and increased crit chance. This should scale nicely without being too expensive up front, but grant you a healthy enough balance of penetration, crit, attack speed, and power for you to feel very powerful in fights. Ability-based builds usually are on hunters that have high damaging, large, and confirmable AoE abilities that can poke really hard frequently. Think gods like Chiron, Neith, or Medusa. Their build will consist of items that enhance their damage from their abilities while increasing their power, cooldown reduction, providing penetration, and maybe some attack speed from time to time. They may also opt for an item that provides sustain off their ability damage. This build is usually meant to damage backliners, and is suboptimal into heavy frontline dive team compositions due to the lack of consistent damage output. This isn't really an attack damage carry build, so I think builds like this are typically better suited in mid lane, especially if the enemy team has 2 or more tanks, but you can flex it into the carry role if you really want to. A sample build might look like Bluestone Brooch for the health, MP5, HP5, and the bonus ability damage from the passive, Jotun's Vigor for cooldown reduction, penetration, and lifesteal sustain, Fail Not for more cooldown reduction, a little bit of crit to kill squishies, and penetration, Crusher for ability damage, attack speed, and penetration, Heartseeker for ability damage and penetration, and then Duality to complement Heartseeker, Crusher, and Brooch, while also providing some attack speed as well. This build provides you with almost capped % penetration, capped CDR, considerable power, and lots of item damage, while providing enough attack speed that you can feel like your basic attacks are powerful too. Some mages were intentionally designed with the carry role in mind, such as Kronos, Freya, ELLEON, and Sol, as they have basic attack stim mechanics in their kit. Since they're under the Mage tab, they have access to an entirely different side of the item store in SMITE 1, meaning they have different items you will need to build for them to be effective. I'll talk specifically about builds that center around your basic attack damage because that is the most typical for mages as an ADC. In SMITE 2, you might consider this to be an intelligence-focused ADC build. Mage carry builds will consist of mostly power, attack speed, lifesteal, and usually flat basic attack damage increase, since mage auto damage scales way less from building power or intelligence. Each mage ADC has their own playstyle. Sol is a tower killer, ELLEON has a massively strong teamfight ultimate that can even slow enemy towers, Kronos is also a tower killer and a late game scaling god, and Freya is an excellent 1v1er that can melt everyone when she gets ahead, but she struggles with killing towers. A couple starters work for these mage ADCs, both Conduit Gem and Gilded Arrow. Conduit provides good clear to help you maintain pressure, and Gilded Arrow provides you higher basic attack damage to help you DPS bastions or towers, or even outtrade the enemy when trading basic attacks. A full example build might look like Diamond Arrow for basic attack damage, penetration, and some conditional attack speed gain and gold gain. Ring of Hecate for early flat penetration, the power diffing passive, and attack speed. Nimble Bancross for the large amount of power and lifesteal, but also the basic attack damage and attack speed later on when you purchase the glyph. Hastened Fatalis for attack speed, penetration, a little HP, and a very strong passive that allows you to stick on enemies. Typhon's Fang, which provides a good amount of penetration and lifesteal as well. Finish with Demonic Grip for some additional attack speed and penetration. It may also be better to go with Gem of Focus instead of Diamond Arrow if you think you won't need the attack speed, you want to be faster, and you want your abilities to deal more damage as well as your autos. Regardless, this build should keep you dealing consistent damage through your autos with lots of penetration and lifesteal to keep you sustained. The mid-roll has around 4 different build variations you might see: a penetration burst build, a lifesteal burst build, a caster build, and an ability-based hunter build. I won't cover the ability-based hunter build here as that was covered in the last section. Mid laners typically want stats that will make their abilities more powerful, which usually includes CDR, both flat and percent penetration, and lots of power. The relic situation will be the same for mids as it is for carries. Beads and Aegis almost every time unless you are specific gods that need to use Blink to get onto the backline to deal damage due to their lack of range, like with Hebo, Zhonghui, or Chang'e. Also, you can justify Shell over Aegis too if necessary as long as you are buying it to counter walls, and they again don't have that much burst. The penetration burst build for mid focuses on making your abilities hit hard both early on and late game. Mages that will do well with this build will be those that can kill squishies in a single kit rotation with ease, oftentimes without using their ultimate ability. Gods that will thrive with this kind of build pathing would include gods like Hera, Thoth, Scylla, and Yu Huang. These builds will usually contain lots of early flat penetration, followed by percent penetration, CDR, and power items. The starters I would go with this build would either be Conduit Gem or Sands of Time, depending on your ability to get CDR from other items, like for instance if you were able to build both Staff of Mirrodin and Spear of Desolation. You could justify going Gem of Focus late game since you'll have a decent amount of CDR just from those 2 items. By the way, if you are unsure if your god's ultimate ability synergizes with Mirrodin, go check out my video on Arthurian items, which I'll link in the description and at the top right of the video, or check out the slightly old but mostly accurate Reddit post in the description, which has a list of all ultimate synergies with Mirrodin up to Yu Huang. A typical build in this archetype might have Pendulum of Ages for CDR and large amounts of power, Doomorb for flat penetration, movement speed, and mana regeneration, Spear of Desolation for penetration and cooldown reduction, Charon's Coin for percent penetration, movement speed, and health and mana regeneration, Soul Reaver for additional damage against tanky targets, and finally either of the Rata Tahuti glyphs for penetration, lots of effective power, and more mana regen. This build would excel at 100 to 0ing squishies with ease while providing adequate damage to tanky targets as well. The Lifesteal Burst build is similar in that it's used by mages that can typically one-shot in a single ability rotation, but it facilitates most of your damage through lifesteal items for the added sustain. Gods with more of a dependency on lifesteal would do well with this build. like Hades, Maman Brigitte, and Anubis. But you can run it on the burst mages mentioned in the penetration burst build as well if you want to sacrifice some of the lane pressure and clear. These builds will contain mostly power, penetration, and lifesteal with a little bit of CDR. The starter for a lifesteal burst build will almost always be Vampiric Shroud building into Sacrificial Shroud late. With that said, an example build could look like Sacrificial Shroud for the lifesteal, ability damage increase, and even a little survivability from its physical protections, Spear of Desolation for the cooldown reduction and penetration, Bancroft's Claw for the lifesteal and the passive that does damage and gives you a shield, Typhon's Fang for added lifesteal and penetration, Soul Reaver for added tank damage, and finally an Obsidian Shard for additional penetration. While low in CDR, this build will bring enough of the hurt and alongside it the heals to outbox the enemy. The last build to go over for mids is a caster build, centered around spamming abilities with item proc damage and low cooldowns. This would be good on mages that cast abilities fairly often, like Merlin, Tiamat, Ixchel, or Raijin. Builds in this category would consist of mostly power, penetration, cooldown reduction, and lots of item proc damage. Starters for this build will usually be either Sands of Time or Conduit Gem, depending on whether your early clear needs the extra help from Conduit. An example build may look like Gem of Focus for the damage increase across the board, plus the added power and additional survivability from its movement speed and HP, Cronus Pendant for the lowered cooldowns and power as well as mana regeneration, Spear of Desolation for the flat penetration, cooldown reduction stat and passive, Charon's Coin for percent penetration, mana regeneration, movement speed, and HP regeneration, Soul Reaver for the powerful damage passive that scales against tanky targets, and Soul Gem for the cooldown reduction, health, lifesteal, and added damage and HP regeneration passive. While only having 20% magical penetration, this build still has enough CDR and item damage from the combination of Gem of Focuses, Soul Reavers, and Soul Gem's passives to deal high damage to tanky targets as well as squishy targets. The jungle role has about 5 different variations of builds. An ability damage build which has an auto attack cancel focused flavor, a bruiser build, a crit build, an auto attack build, and yet another mage build for the magical junglers. There's a lot of build diversity in SMITE in the jungle role, but I'll do my best to give you an overall rundown of these 5 build identities. Junglers in general want items that facilitate their ability to engage on enemy backliners and kill low health enemies. That's why I believe Beads and Blink should be the 2 most common relics for a jungler, with Aegis being a flex pick over Blink if your god has very strong engage potential from their abilities like Bastet, Thor, or Tsukuyomi for example. The first jungle build archetype is probably the most popular one, and it's an ability damage build that focuses on enhancing the damage from your abilities primarily, while also allowing you to weave in powerful basic attacks between them, a technique known as auto attack canceling. There's a flavor of this build that puts more emphasis on auto attack canceling as well. Gods that will work well with this type of ability damage would be gods like Susanoo, Loki, Bastet, and Thor, with gods like Loki and Susanoo being good candidates for the auto attack cancel flavor, given their ability to fit in quick auto attacks between their abilities effectively. These builds will focus on enhancing abilities through power, both types of penetration, cooldown reduction, lifesteal, and ability item damage, with the auto attack cancel flavor adding increased damage from basic attacks. The best starter for this build would be primarily Bumba's Dagger for the CDR on the upgrades or for the Bumba's Hammer passive to enhance auto attack cancels. But there is some ability to flex into Eye of the Jungle if you want some extra protections late game. A full build may look like Bumba's Spear for the added power passive, penetration, CDR, and sustain in the jungle, Jotun's Vigor for sustain, CDR, and flat penetration, Transcendence for lots of power, some mana, and some flat penetration, Crusher for percent penetration, some attack speed, and increased damage on abilities from the passive as well, Heartseeker for the added percent penetration, mana synergy with Transcendence's passive, and also the tank damage from the passive on your abilities, followed by Erendite last for the movement speed, CDR, and increased damage on abilities after casting your ultimate ability. I would switch Transcendence or Erendite for Hydras, and Bumba's Spear for Bumba's Hammer if you feel your character falls under the auto attack cancel category. Regardless of which of those routes you take, you will be slamming both carries and tanks for lots of damage with your abilities. Maybe even your autos, all while giving you lots of CDs, some sustain, lots of power, and lots of early pressure from your flat penetration. The next jungle build archetype is the Bruiser archetype, which focuses on outputting damage while still having some tankiness for yourself, facilitating you to take some riskier fights while still making it out alive. Some gods that are good with this build are those that have high CC, lots of stims, or maybe some sustain in their kit already by default. For example, Mulan, Awelish, Lancelot, or Robin. This build will focus mostly on power with a couple protection items, some CDR, penetration, and some utility passives. The best starter for this would be Eye of the Jungle, as both of his upgrades have protections, with one in particular granting many protections. An example build may look like Protector of the Jungle for the power and protections, but also the passive that grants additional power and protections when in the jungle, Jotunsbigger for the flat penetration, CDR, and movement speed plus sustain from the Glyph passive, Shifter's Shield for the protections, large health injection, HP regen stat, and conditional bonus protections or power, Serrated Edge for the movement speed, percent penetration, and lifesteal, Rune Breaking Hammer, assuming your god has hard CC, for some more health, mana and HP regeneration, and a strong passive that causes them to take more damage and deal less damage. And finally, a Heartseeker for the added percent penetration and damage on abilities. This build should keep you feeling tanky, but also powerful as you weave in and out of fights. The third build I'll go over is the Crit build, which is a niche archetype that only works on a select few characters well. Mostly those that rely on 100 zeroing with autos in a quick burst, or those with abilities that can crit. It is in another way a burst build, but instead it relies on critical strikes over abilities and woven in basic attacks. Gods that would work well with this build are those like Neja, Mercury, Serket, or Nemesis, as they all either rely heavily on dealing large damage with basic attacks, or they have abilities that can critically strike. This build will focus heavily on crit chance, power, penetration, basic attack damage, and lifesteal, with maybe some flexibility to go attack speed or CDR. Any of the three jungle starters would work, but I would expect Eye of the Jungle or Bumba's Hammer on most crit jungle builds. An example build may look like Bumba's Spear for the penetration, CDR, some regen, increased jungle clear, and the power passive, Hydra's for the percent penetration, CDR, mana regen, and the increased basic attack damage passive, Rage for the lots of crit chance, Serrated Edge for the lifesteal, percent penetration, and movement speed, Bloodforge for the lifesteal, movement speed, and the passive, which gives you a shield and movement speed upon getting a kill, and finally Malicious Deathbringer for the extra crit chance, cooldown reduction passive, and added damage on your critical strikes. This should be well-rounded enough to keep you casting abilities and extremely powerful auto attacks while dealing significant damage and sustaining yourself to keep on fighting. The fourth build to cover under jungle is the auto attack based build, which will shred tanks by means of item damage, but at the same time bring high DPS to objectives and squishies. Warriors or assassins that have a very fast auto attack progression would benefit the most from this build. For example, Arachne, Erlong Shen, and Kali all have unique attack progressions with swing times being close to 1x or below 1x, allowing them to proc items more often than other jungle gods. This build will focus on attack speed, power, penetration, and basic attack item damage through proc items. Good starter items for this build would either be Mannequin Scepter or Eye of the Jungle, as both have upgrades with attack speed on them. An example build might be Mannequin Mace for the basic attack damage, attack speed, basic attack item proc damage, objective damage, and a little bit of protections and attack speed reduction, Crimson Claws for the power, attack speed, lifesteal, and the nice shield it provides, Odysseus's Bow for the attack speed and the basic attack item proc damage from the passive, which can help you clear camps, Executioner for the protection shred on your basic attacks, attack speed, and the powerful glyphs which you can flex between, Kinsai for the attack speed and the tank-centered shred item proc passive, and finally Serrated Edge for movement speed, lifesteal, and lots of percent penetration. This build will help you to melt tanks, deal a significant amount of damage to everyone else as well, and keep you sustained and powerful on objectives. The last build is for magical junglers. Some mages and also some guardians can flex into the jungle role, and they will primarily play like the physical ability assassins, just using magical power items, or in SMITE 2, intelligence items. Gods that will excel as magical junglers are those with high burst, chase potential, and maybe some CC elements in their kit. Some good examples of magical jungle gods may be Ao Kuang, Morgan Le Fay, my personal favorite, Athena, or He Bo, as they have high burst, good chase, good single target lockdown, and good jungle clear. The builds for magical junglers will focus on magical power, movement speed, flat penetration, cooldown rate, and percent penetration, with maybe some lifesteal as well. The best starters for magical junglers will be either Eye of the Jungle or Bumba's Hammer, as both of those will increase your clear and sustain in the jungle by using your abilities. A good example build may be Bumba's Spear for the increased power, sustain, penetration, CDR, and jungle damage, Do More for the movement speed, flat penetration, and mana sustain, Spear of Desolation for flat penetration, CDR, and the CDR passive, Bancroft's Claw for the massive influx of power, lifesteal, and the bonus damage and shielding from the passive, Typhon's Fang for the percent penetration, lifesteal, and increased lifesteal healing and power from the passive, and then finally Perfected Rod of Tahuti for the penetration, MP5, increased power against low HP targets from the passive, and increased CD reduction and movement speed from the glyph. This should keep you sustained and dealing enough damage to the carries so that you can deal massive burst and get out or keep chasing kills. While there is a ton of build diversity in support due to the larger need to counterbuild or supplement your team, there's still a couple categories that your builds will most likely fall into: backline support builds or frontline support builds. Not only do they have such high build diversity, they also have high relic diversity. As a support, you don't usually need beads, or especially Aegis, to get your damage and CC off for your team because you're so tanky. Supports can definitely still get beads if they are worried about high CC that could get them killed if they have no recourse, like Ares ultimate, Fenrir ultimate, and especially Ao Kuang ultimate. Aside from that, I would suggest using your knowledge of your teammates' gods and your enemies' gods to determine which relics to go. Support relics include Blink for facilitating engages or closing gaps, Bracer for additional warding and stat boosts for your team, Meditation for healing and CD reduction for your team, Divine Barrier to slow enemies or counter a team with many ranged auto attackers, or even facilitate your own auto attackers, Entangling Wings to cleanse slows, boost attack speed, or root enemies to set up for damage or CC, Horrific Emblem to reduce enemy damage, movement speed, and shielding, Phantom Shell to temporarily prevent damage on your team, reduce incoming damage from basic attacks, jungle bosses, or towers, or allow your team to walk through deployable barriers, and Sunder to increase an enemy's damage taken, destroy their active shields, and deal some damage based on their HP. Again, knowing what order to pick your relics and which ones to pick depends heavily on what your team needs and what the enemy team does or has for relics themselves. The build for frontline supports typically enables them to dive carries, dealing damage and setting up for the jungler or solo laner to claim the kill. Gods that will do well with a build like this are those tanky gods that have higher than average damage in lockdown. Some examples of this may be Bacchus, Kabrakan, Kuzenbo, or Sobek, as all of them have high damaging and high CC kits with lots of lockdown or potential to facilitate a pick on the enemy team. This build will focus mostly on protections, health, mitigations, passives that deal damage or increase enemy damage taken, and cooldown reduction. Frontline supports are typically a bit more selfish, and therefore may want to refrain from going the more team-oriented starters and opt for something which may keep you in the fight longer. My suggestions would be either Sentinel's Gift or Warflag, as Benevolence's upgrades are strictly backline support oriented. An example build might be Sentinel's Boon for the protections, HP, added gold gain, and high sustain upon getting assists from minion kills, Gauntlet of Thebes for the high protections, health, aura protections, and slight HP 5, Stone of Binding for the health, protections, and protection reduction off of your CC, Glorious Pridwin for the protections, CDR, and damage from the shield passive, Gladiator's Shield for the physical protections, health, cooldown reduction, and additional damage from your protections, and Abyssal Stone for the protections, health, and CD reduction passive. This should give you plenty of tankiness, cooldown reduction, sustain, and some good damage and offensive utility against backliners. For backline supports, their build should enable your carries to live as long as possible, and deal as much damage as possible, while screwing over enemy dive. Gods that will play as backline supports will be those that provide healing, shields, or protections to nearby allies, but also can CC enemy dive to turn the fight and set up kills for the carries. Some examples of backline support gods would be Ganesha, Khepri, Aphrodite, or Yamoja, as all of them have ways to provide either protections or sustain to their backline, and have setup and disruptive abilities to punish enemy dive. Most stats in this build will center around aura protections or mitigations, CDR, health, and flexible counter items to either support your backline or counter their frontline. All three of the support starter items are viable. That's Sentinel's Gift, Benevolence, or Warflag. An example build may be Compassion for the gold gain, magical protections, health, and the passive that provides damage mitigation to nearby teammates. Gauntlet of Thebes for the health, HP 5, protections, and aura prots. Reverend Pridwin for the CDR, prots, and large HP health shield for some added sustain. Magi's Shelter for the protections, CDR, and the passive that grants CC immunity to your allies. Eldritch Dagger for the health, movement speed, CDR, CCR, and the passive that reduces your relic cooldowns drastically while giving you the ability to see wards and giving you additional prots after using a relic. And then finally, Midgardian Mail for the HP, physical protections, and the passive that slows enemy basic attackers' attack speed and movement speed for hitting you. Of course, the healer backline gods can opt for healing bolstering items like Rod of Asclepius, Lotus Sickle, or Fey Blessed Hoops. A build like this should give you enough utility to keep your backliners alive longer from your plentiful CDR, your decreased relic cooldown timers, and your auras. The final builds to cover are for solo lane, and just like the support role, they also have very high build diversity because they can opt for more situational items than the carry roles. I'd say there's 3 main categories of builds in solo: an auto attack focused tank build, an ability dive focused build, and a guardian solo build. Typically, they will want to use the first couple items to build defense that matches the type of their lane opponent or some sustain to help in lane, followed by several situational items. Solo relics are typically teleport glyph first to get back to lane faster, and then either blink to help facilitate engages, thorns to punish enemies that hit you while you dive them, or beads if the enemy team is high CC and you might need a way to get your casts off or avoid being locked down too much. The first build to cover for solo lane is the auto attack tank build, which is intended to make you deal high damage from hitting autos, potentially out-trading ADCs, while staying pretty tanky. Gods that will synergize well with this build will be those warriors that have attack damage or attack speed stims, cleave autos, or basic attack chains that help to proc basic attack items more frequently than the average god. Some examples of solo lane gods that would work well with this type of build would be Bellona, Osiris, Gilgamesh, or Amaterasu. The build will typically focus on protections, attack speed, power, and basic attack damage item procs with 1 or 2 flex items. You can justify a few starter items for this build as they have upgrades that can all benefit your basic attacks. Death's Toll is good for in-lane sustain and some damage, especially if you have cleave autos. Warrior's Axe can give you some early protections and poke, and Bluestone can increase your clear and your poke but sacrifices survivability. A good example build might look like Axe of Animosity for the protections, health, crowd control reduction, and the increased damage on your auto attacks based on your max HP. Berserker's Shield for the physical protections, attack speed, health, HP 5, and the attack speed and damage mitigation passive. Shogun's Kusari for the large amount of attack speed, health, MP5, magical protections, and the attack speed aura for the team. Chinsai for the power, attack speed, and the basic attack damage based on a percentage of their HP. Stone of Binding for the protections, health, and the protection shred passive. And then finally Spirit Robe for the protections, crowd control reduction, and the damage mitigation passive. This build should give you ample protections, attack speed, and auto attack item proc damage so that you can get in there and box enemies with ease. The next build would be for ability-based solo lane divers that get into the backline and dump lots of damage and CC with their abilities. Gods that do well with this type of build are those with large, hard-hitting AoE ultimate abilities and CC that can truly disrupt or lock down enemies. Some examples of gods for this type of build would be Achilles, Chaac, Kukulin, or Sun Wukong. This build archetype focuses on power, sustain, protections, CDR, and ability-based item proc damage. Some good starter items for it would be Bluestone or Warrior's Axe, as both of them have upgrades that deal additional damage on your abilities. An example build may look like Bluestone Brooch for the power, MP5, HP5, health, and health-based bonus damage on hitting an ability, Soul Eater for the power, lifesteal, ability lifesteal, cooldown reduction, and flat penetration upon evolving, Gladiator's Shield for the health, physical protections, HP5, cooldown reduction, and additional ability damage based on your protections, Oni Hunter's Garb for the magical protections, health, MP5, and passive damage mitigations when near enemies, Glorious Pridwin for the protections, cooldown reduction, and powerful exploding shield upon casting your ultimate ability, and then finally Abyssal Stone for the protections, health, and the cooldown reduction debuff that will make your abilities even more powerful in fights. A build like this will get you dealing high damage to squishies while sustaining enough damage to get all of your buttons off in fights. And the last build archetype to cover for this role and for this video will be the Guardian solo build, which may play similarly to the ability Warrior build, but instead for magical Guardians which tend to have more CC than their Warrior counterparts. In SMITE 2, Guardians will likely have builds similar to the ability Warrior build covered above, but maybe with a little more intelligence scaling woven in. Guardians that synergize with this build will be those that are relatively mobile and have decent clear, higher damage potential than other Guardians, and also have very impactful CC. Some examples of good Guardian solo gods would be Artio, Cerberus, Cthulhu, or Jormungandr. This build would focus on some ability damage proc items, health, protections, magical power, cooldown reduction, and percent damage mitigation. The best starter items for this archetype will usually be either Conduit Gem for the added wave clear, or Vampiric Shroud for the added sustain, as long as your clear is strong enough to survive laning phase without too much trouble. An example build might look like Gem of Focus for the magical power, health, MP5, and movement speed and damage increase passive, Curse Weaver for the power, health, mana, and both the damaging and healing passive item proc, Gladiator's Shield for the physical protections, health, HP5, cooldown reduction, and added ability damage based on your protections, Glorious Pridwin for the protections, cooldown reduction, and exploding shield upon casting your ultimate ability, Oni Hunter's Garb for the magical protections, health, MP5, and passive damage mitigations when near enemies, and finally Ethereal Staff for the power, health, crowd control reduction, and health and mana steal upon hitting enemies, providing you some tankiness while depriving the enemy of some tankiness. This build should give you enough damage output to be threatening without taking too much damage, allowing you to get in there and dump all of your crowd control and damage in teamfights. Alright, that wraps it up for this SMITE build guide. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments, and I'll get to them as soon as I can. This video was created based on a suggestion from the comments on my last video, so if you have any more suggestions for future vids, let me know and I might make a video about your topic. Thank you for watching, and remember to subscribe for more content like this.